Don't waste your breath apologizing to him, sweetheart. The man hasn't heard a human voice in 3 years. The laughter came from a corner booth at Bellucci's, one of Manhattan's most exclusive Italian restaurants, but Elena Moretti didn't laugh with them. She stood beneath the amber pendant lights with a tray pressed against her curvy hip, her cheeks burning, while 4 men in tailored suits stared at her as if she were part of the evening's entertainment. At 29, Elena had learned how quickly strangers could turn a woman's body into a punchline. She was full-figured, soft around the waist, broad through the hips, and completely done pretending cruel comments didn't hurt. Tonight, however, she needed the shift. Her rent was 6 days late, her mother's medical bills were stacked beside the microwave in their Queens apartment, and losing another job was not an option. Table 12 asked for sparkling water. Her manager hissed behind her, "Try not to embarrass us again." Elena swallowed the humiliation and walked toward the private section, unaware that every waiter in the restaurant had spent the last hour avoiding the man seated there. Luca DeSantis was 36, impossibly wealthy, and feared from Brooklyn to Atlantic City as the Mafia Boss who controlled the DeSantis organization with one cold glance and fewer words than most men used ordering coffee. 3 years earlier, an explosion meant for him had taken something no enemy had ever managed to steal before, his hearing. Since that night, Luca had lived inside silence. He read lips when necessary, relied on discreet hand signals with his guards, and trusted almost no one. The loss had hardened an already guarded man. Deals happened when he nodded. Men stopped talking when he entered. And tonight, dressed in a charcoal suit beside a rain-streaked window, Luca looked less like a customer than a king, temporarily allowing the restaurant to exist around him. Elena approached with the water. One of Luca's associates leaned back and deliberately stretched his foot into her path. She stumbled. The bottle slipped. Cold water splashed across the white tablecloth. A few people gasped. Then came the laughter. "Careful," the same man said, smirking. "Maybe the floor couldn't handle the impact." Elena froze. Her fingers tightened around the tray. For one painful second, she was 16 again, standing in a cafeteria while boys mocked the size of her uniform. But this time, she didn't shrink. She slowly set the tray down, looked the man directly in the eye, and said, "Funny. I was going to apologize for spilling the water, but I don't remember spilling any on your personality." The nearby tables went silent. Luca couldn't hear the laughter stop, but he saw it. He saw the associate's grin disappear. He saw Elena's trembling hand beside the bottle. More importantly, he saw her straighten her shoulders, even though she was clearly fighting tears. Luca raised 2 fingers. His bodyguard immediately stepped forward. The associate went pale. Luca signed one short command, "Leave." No argument followed. The man stood and walked out under the gaze of the entire restaurant. Elena stared at Luca, unsettled by how quickly power moved around him. "Thank you," she said automatically, forgetting he couldn't hear her. Luca watched her lips. His expression remained unreadable. Elena turned to clean the table, but when she bent to retrieve a fallen napkin, something slipped from the pocket of her apron and landed near Luca's polished shoe, a small black case. Elena's face changed instantly. Not embarrassment this time. Fear. She lunged for it, but Luca reached down first. His guard moved closer, suspicious. Elena whispered, "Please, give me that." Luca studied the case, then looked at her. There was something desperate in her eyes, something that made him hesitate. Elena slowly opened her palm. "You don't understand," she said. "That belonged to my father." Then she did something no one in Luca DeSantis' world would have dared. She took the case from his hand, flipped it open, and pulled out a tiny silver device. Luca's bodyguard reached for her wrist. Luca stopped him with one sharp gesture. Elena stepped closer, close enough that Luca could see the nervous rise of her breath, and raised the strange device toward him. 3 years of absolute silence had taught Luca never to expect miracles. But the moment Elena pressed it against the bone behind his ear, his entire body went rigid. Because somewhere inside the silence, Luca DeSantis heard something. The sound was faint, almost nothing, a thin metallic vibration beneath the roar of blood rushing through Luca DeSantis' body. But after 3 years of silence, it struck him harder than a gunshot. His hand clamped around the edge of the table. Elena Moretti immediately pulled the silver device away, terrified she had hurt him. "I'm sorry," she said, backing up half a step. Luca stared at her lips, then at the device in her hand. His bodyguard, Marco Bellini, moved between them, but Luca caught his sleeve and shook his head. Marco froze. Luca pointed toward the device. Elena swallowed. "It's a bone conduction prototype," she explained carefully, unsure how much he could understand from reading her lips. "My father worked with hearing technology before he died. He built this for patients whose ears couldn't process sound normally." Luca's expression hardened at the word died. He extended his hand. Elena hesitated before placing the device in his palm. Around them, the entire restaurant had gone still. Then Elena's manager stormed over, his face red. "That's enough. You're done, Elena. Pack your things." Elena closed her eyes for 1 second. She had known humiliation before, but losing this job meant losing the only paycheck keeping her mother's apartment from falling behind. "Sir, I can explain. You touched a private guest without permission." The manager reached for her arm. Luca rose. He didn't shout. He couldn't hear the room, yet somehow everyone felt the silence deepen. 6'2" in a charcoal suit, Luca stepped directly between Elena and the manager. He looked at the man's hand still hovering inches from her wrist, then slowly lifted his eyes. Marco translated Luca's signed words. "Mr. DeSantis says if you touch her, this restaurant changes ownership before dessert." The manager's face drained of colour. Luca signed again. Marco almost smiled. "And she is not fired." Elena stared at Luca. "You don't have to do that." Luca read her lips. His gaze sharpened as if the idea offended him. He took a pen from his jacket, wrote 5 words on a linen cocktail napkin, and slid it toward her. "I decide what I have to do." Elena almost laughed, despite herself. "That sounds exhausting." Luca watched her mouth, and something unexpected moved across his face, not quite a smile, but close enough that Marco noticed. No one spoke to Luca DeSantis that way. No one survived in his orbit by treating him like an ordinary man. Yet Elena had. Luca pointed to the device again. She shook her head. "It isn't finished. My father warned me it could fail if the pressure setting is wrong." Luca held out his hand anyway. Elena studied him, then stepped closer. The restaurant lights caught the dark scar disappearing behind his left ear, a scar she hadn't noticed before. Her expression softened, but she didn't pity him. Luca noticed that too. She carefully positioned the silver device against the bone behind his ear. "I'm going to increase it slowly," she said. "Tell me if it hurts." Luca couldn't hear the words, but he understood her lips. Elena adjusted a tiny dial. Static crackled into his world. Luca jerked slightly. Then came another sound, a soft clink. He turned his head sharply. A spoon had fallen at a nearby table. His breathing changed. 3 years ago, the last thing Luca had heard was an explosion tearing through his car and his younger brother calling his name. Since then, silence had become armor. Now that armor had a crack in it. Elena whispered, "Can you hear me?" Luca focused on her face. The device buzzed. Her voice came through distorted, distant, imperfect, but unmistakably human. Luca's eyes locked onto hers. "Can you hear me?" she repeated. His throat moved. When he finally spoke, his own voice sounded strange inside his skull. Again. Elena's eyes filled instantly. "Can you hear me?" This time Luca closed his eyes. 1 breath. 2. Then he opened them and nodded. Elena covered her mouth, overwhelmed by what she had just witnessed. But across the room, Marco was no longer looking at either of them. He was staring through the front window at a black SUV parked across the street. The same SUV that had followed Luca from Brooklyn. Marco signed urgently. "We have company." Luca turned. 2 men inside the vehicle were photographing Elena. His softness vanished. He removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders, shielding her from the window before guiding her behind him. Elena looked up at him, confused. Luca signed to Marco without taking his eyes off the SUV. "Find out who they are." Then he turned back to Elena and spoke slowly, forcing out words he had not heard himself say in 3 years. "You're coming with me." Elena stiffened. "Absolutely not." For the second time that night, Luca nearly smiled. Then Marco's phone vibrated. He read the message and his face changed. The license plate belonged to a man Luca had believed dead for 3 years, the same man connected to the explosion that destroyed his hearing. And somehow that man had just started watching Elena Moretti. By the time Luca DeSantis' armoured sedan crossed the Queensboro Bridge, Elena Moretti had decided 3 things. The coat around her shoulders cost more than 3 months of her rent. The silent men surrounding her were definitely not ordinary security, and agreeing to enter a Mafia boss's car had been the worst decision she had made all year. "I said I'm not going anywhere with you," she repeated, sitting rigidly beside Luca while Manhattan disappeared behind rain-streaked glass. Luca watched her lips, then glanced toward Marco Bellini in the front seat. Marco turned around. "Mr. DeSantis says the men outside Bellucci's weren't watching him anymore. They were watching you." Elena's irritation vanished. "Why would anyone watch me?" Luca placed the silver hearing device on his palm between them. Elena's eyes dropped to it. That was when Marco's phone vibrated again. He read the message and went still. The SUV belonged to a shell company connected to Victor Sands, a former DeSantis lieutenant Luca had once trusted like family. 3 years earlier, Victor had supposedly died 2 days after the explosion that destroyed Luca's hearing and killed Luca's younger brother, Matteo. Luca had never believed in coincidences. Now Victor's name had risen from the dead less than 10 minutes after Elena activated her father's device. Luca signed sharply. Marco translated, "He wants to know your father's full name." Elena hesitated. "Dr. Samuel Moretti." Luca's expression changed. Not recognition exactly, something colder. He reached for his phone, typed one name, and showed Marco. Marco stared at the screen. Samuel Moretti consulted for DeSantis Medical Operations 4 years ago. Elena looked between them. "My father designed hearing devices. He wasn't involved with criminals." Luca's eyes held hers. Marco lowered his voice. Maybe not willingly. Elena recoiled as if struck. Her father had died 11 months earlier after what police called a late-night car accident. He had left behind unpaid bills, boxes of unfinished prototypes, and one final warning Elena had never understood. Never let anyone know what the silver unit can do. Before she could explain, the sedan suddenly slowed. Luca's hand moved across Elena instinctively, stopping her from pitching forward. His palm never grabbed her. It simply created a barrier between her body and danger. Elena noticed. So did Luca. Marco checked the road ahead. Construction closure. Luca's eyes narrowed. There had been no construction when they crossed this route an hour earlier. A black sedan appeared behind them. Then another. Elena's breathing shortened. Luca tapped the partition twice. His driver immediately took the next exit. No gunfire, no dramatic chase. Just 3 dark vehicles moving through wet Queen streets while Luca's security team quietly changed routes like men who had practiced surviving ambushes for years. Elena looked at Luca. "Is this normal for you?" He read her lips and signed one word. "Unfortunately." Despite everything, Elena almost smiled. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. Luca saw the fear in her face before she answered. "Hello?" A man's voice came through cold and calm. "Elena Moretti, you have something that belongs to me." Elena's colour drained. Luca could not hear the caller clearly through the prototype, but the device captured enough vibration for him to recognize a male voice. "Who is this?" Elena asked. The man laughed softly. "Ask Luca what happened to his brother." Luca's entire body went motionless. Elena stared at him. "How do you know I'm with him?" The caller ignored the question. "Your father stole a component 3 years ago. You just activated it. Now every person who has been searching for it knows exactly where you are." The line went dead. Elena's hand trembled. "My father didn't steal anything." Luca reached for her phone, but she pulled it back. "No. You don't get to investigate me like I'm one of your enemies." Luca's jaw tightened. Marco turned halfway around. "Elena, Victor Sands was behind the attack that killed Matteo. And what does that have to do with my father?" Nobody answered. That silence frightened her more than the phone call. 20 minutes later, they entered a guarded townhouse in Brooklyn that served as one of Luca's secure residences. Elena refused to sit. She paced beneath the low golden lights, still wrapped in Luca's coat, while Marco searched Dr. Moretti's records. Luca stood near the window, keeping himself between her and the glass. Then Marco found something. "Luca." He turned the laptop around. A scanned payment ledger showed Samuel Moretti receiving $250,000 3 weeks before the explosion. The payment came from a DeSantis account. Elena stared at the screen. That's impossible. Another file opened. It was a security photograph from 3 years earlier. Samuel Moretti stood beside Victor Sands outside a warehouse. Elena's face crumpled, but she refused to cry. Someone framed him. Luca stepped closer. She backed away. "Don't look at me like that." His expression softened immediately. He raised both hands, showing her he would not touch her without permission. Then Marco's phone buzzed one final time. A photograph had arrived from Victor's number. It showed Elena's mother leaving her apartment in Queens less than 5 minutes earlier. Beneath the image were 6 words, "Bring me the device by midnight." Elena stopped breathing. Luca read the message, and whatever tenderness had entered his face disappeared behind something deadly and controlled. He took the silver device from the table, placed it carefully back into Elena's hand, and closed her fingers around it. Then he looked at Marco and signed one command. "Protect her mother." Elena whispered, "What are you going to do?" Luca turned toward her. Through the imperfect device behind his ear, her voice reached him in fragments, but he heard enough. "I'm going to find Victor." Elena shook her head. "Then I'm coming with you." Luca's eyes hardened. She stepped closer instead of retreating. "That's my mother. That was my father. And if someone used him to destroy your family, I deserve the truth too." For the first time that night, Luca understood something his enemies had not. Elena Moretti was afraid, but fear did not make her weak. Then Marco opened the final attachment Victor had sent, and the room went silent. It was an old photograph of Luca unconscious after the explosion. Kneeling beside him, pressing blood-soaked hands against his wounds, was a younger Elena Moretti. Elena stared at the photograph until the edges blurred. "That isn't possible." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. On Marco's laptop, the image showed a rainy Brooklyn street 3 years earlier, twisted metal scattered across the pavement, flames climbing from the wreckage of Luca DeSantis's black SUV. Luca lay unconscious beside the curb, blood darkening his shirt, while a younger Elena knelt over him with both hands pressed against his chest. Luca watched her face instead of the photograph. He saw recognition arrive slowly, painfully. "I remember the accident," Elena said. "I was coming home from my father's lab. I heard an explosion 2 blocks away and ran toward it." She looked at Luca. "I didn't know who you were." Luca's expression remained still, but something inside him shifted. For 3 years, he had believed one of his men dragged him from the wreckage. Instead, the woman standing in his safe house, the curvy waitress strangers had mocked only hours ago, had been the first person who tried to keep him alive. Marco enlarged the photograph. There's more. Behind Elena, half hidden by smoke, stood Samuel Moretti, and Samuel was holding the same silver device Elena now carried. She stepped closer to the screen. "My father was there?" Marco nodded. According to the timestamp, he arrived 7 minutes before emergency services. Elena shook her head. "He never told me." Luca touched her arm lightly, then immediately released it when she stiffened. The gesture was not control. It was a question. "Are you all right?" Elena understood. "No," she whispered, "but keep going." Marco opened another recovered file. It was an encrypted audio transcript from Samuel's private archive. The words on the screen changed everything. Samuel had not been working for Victor Sands. He had been forced to build a specialized bone conduction device capable of transmitting sound through damaged auditory pathways, but Victor wanted something else hidden inside it, a miniature encrypted storage chip. The prototype was not valuable because it could help Luca hear. It was valuable because it contained evidence. Names, payments, warehouse locations, bribes. Every transaction Victor had used to betray the DeSantis family from inside. Elena slowly looked down at the device in her hand. "My father hid evidence inside this?" Marco nodded, and apparently he gave Victor a fake version before the explosion. Luca's jaw tightened. Suddenly the payment to Samuel made sense. Victor had moved money through a DeSantis account to make Samuel look guilty if anything went wrong. Elena's father had been framed long before he died. She pressed one hand over her mouth, fighting tears. He knew they'd come after him. Luca stepped closer, but did not touch her. Elena lifted her eyes. "That car accident 11 months ago," Marco answered softly, "may not have been an accident." The room seemed to shrink around her. Elena turned away, shoulders trembling beneath Luca's coat. For the first time all night, her strength cracked. "I spent 11 months angry at him," she said. "He left me debt, secrets, boxes I couldn't understand. I thought he trusted his work more than he trusted me." Luca moved into her line of sight and lowered himself slightly so she did not have to look up at him. Then, slowly, he signed while Marco translated. Your father trusted you enough to leave the truth where only you could protect it. Elena's eyes filled. One tear escaped. Luca lifted his hand, paused, giving her time to refuse, then brushed the tear from her cheek with his thumb. The feared Mafia Boss who could silence entire rooms touched her as if sadness were something fragile. You don't even know me, Elena whispered. Through the silver device, her words reached him, broken but clear enough. Luca answered aloud, his voice low and rough. You saved me. Elena shook her head. Anyone would have. Luca's gaze held hers. No, they didn't. For one quiet second, the danger outside disappeared. Then Marco's phone rang. His face hardened before he even answered. It's the team at Elena's mother's apartment. Elena turned instantly. Is she safe? Marco listened, then looked at Luca. She never came home. Elena went pale. A second message arrived from Victor. This time there was a live video. Elena's mother sat unharmed but frightened in a chair inside an abandoned riverside warehouse. Behind her, a digital clock counted down from 54 minutes. Victor stepped into frame, smiling. Midnight was generous, he said. I've changed my mind. He held up a small detonator. Bring Elena and Samuel's device to Pier 19 in 45 minutes, or her mother disappears with every secret Samuel died protecting. Luca's expression turned lethal. Elena grabbed the device and headed for the door. Luca blocked her path. Move. He shook his head. That's my mother. Luca signed quickly. Marco translated. Victor wants you there because he thinks you can unlock the files. Elena stared at the silver device. Can I? Marco looked at the decrypted notes. Your fingerprint may be the encryption key. Elena gave a bitter laugh. Then we don't have a choice. Luca stepped closer until only inches separated them. His eyes said what his voice could not easily express. He would not trade her life for information. Elena understood that too. She placed her palm flat against his chest. You protected me tonight. Let me help finish what my father started. Luca looked down at her hand, then back into her eyes. After a long moment, he nodded once, not because he had surrendered control, but because he trusted her. Marco began assembling the security team. Elena turned toward the door, but Luca caught her hand gently. He placed the silver hearing device behind his ear and spoke slowly. Stay beside me. Elena squeezed his fingers. Only if you stay beside me. Then Marco opened Samuel's final encrypted note. One sentence appeared across the screen, written 3 years earlier. If Luca DeSantis survives, tell him the man who betrayed him is not Victor Sands. Luca went completely still. Beneath that sentence was another name, the name of someone still inside the DeSantis family. The name on Samuel Moretti's final note was Antonio DeSantis, Luca's uncle, his father's younger brother, and the man who had managed the family's finances for nearly 15 years. Luca read it twice. His face revealed nothing, but Elena felt his fingers tighten around hers. Antonio had stood beside Luca at Matteo's funeral. He had approved security changes after the explosion. He had even been the one who convinced Luca that Victor Sands had died. He had access to the account that paid my father, Elena whispered. Marco nodded grimly, and every route Luca used 3 years ago. Luca removed the silver hearing device, stared at it for 1 second, then placed it back behind his ear. He signed to Marco. No one contacts Antonio. We go to Pier 19 exactly as Victor asked. 28 minutes later, rain swept across the abandoned Brooklyn waterfront as 2 black DeSantis vehicles stopped 50 yards from Warehouse 12. The East River shimmered beneath industrial lights. Elena sat beside Luca, her father's device hidden beneath her coat, watching the countdown on Victor's video reach 11 minutes. Promise me something, she said. Luca turned toward her. If they make you choose between whatever is on this device and my mother, choose my mother. Luca's eyes hardened. And if they make you choose between your empire and me, she asked. He answered without hesitation. You. Elena's breath caught. Luca opened the door before she could respond. Inside the warehouse, Elena's mother sat near the center of the concrete floor, guarded but unharmed. Victor Sands stood beside her, older than his photograph, scarred by 3 years in hiding, but very much alive. Luca, Victor called. The prototype carried his voice imperfectly across the warehouse. Still difficult to kill. Luca stepped in front of Elena. Victor smiled, always protecting the wrong person. Then slow applause echoed from the upper walkway. Antonio DeSantis descended the metal stairs in an immaculate black overcoat. Luca didn't move. Elena did. She looked at Antonio, then at Luca, and understood immediately why his emotional walls were so high. Betrayal had not come from an enemy. It had come from family. Matteo discovered the accounts, Antonio said calmly. Samuel discovered too much. Victor handled what needed handling. Victor's smile disappeared. You said nobody was supposed to die. Antonio barely glanced at him. That single look told Elena everything. Victor had been useful, not trusted. Antonio extended his hand. The device, Elena. Her mother shook her head desperately. Don't. Elena's hands trembled, but she stepped out from behind Luca. He caught her wrist gently. She met his eyes. Trust me. 2 words. That was all. Luca released her. Antonio laughed. She has more courage than your entire council, Luca. That's why you'll lose, Elena said. She walked forward and removed the silver device. Antonio held out his palm. Unlock it. Elena pressed her thumb against the tiny sensor. A green light appeared. Somewhere inside the device, Samuel Moretti's encrypted archive opened. Antonio smiled. What he didn't know was that Elena had spent the drive studying her father's engineering notes. The moment her fingerprint unlocked the device, it also triggered a backup function Samuel had designed for emergencies. Elena tapped the side twice. Her phone vibrated inside her pocket. Upload started. Every ledger, recording, payment and message began transmitting to Marco and to every senior DeSantis council member Luca trusted. Antonio's phone started ringing first. Then Victor's. Then 3 guards looked down at theirs. Antonio's smile vanished. What did you do? Elena lifted her chin. What my father died trying to do. I made sure the truth couldn't disappear with one person. Antonio lunged for the device, but Luca was already there. He stepped between them, forcing Antonio back without touching Elena. At the same moment, Marco's team entered through the side doors and moved Elena's mother to safety. Victor raised his hands. I'm done protecting him, he said, looking at Antonio. Matteo was never supposed to be in that car. Luca froze at his brother's name. Antonio saw the opening and reached beneath his coat. Elena saw the movement first. Luca! She shoved him sideways. A gunshot cracked through the warehouse. For the first time in 3 years, Luca heard it. He turned instantly. Elena was still standing, but Luca staggered against a steel pillar, one hand gripping his shoulder. Luca! Elena ran to him. Antonio backed toward the river exit, holding the detonator he had shown on the video. Nobody moves, he shouted. His thumb hovered over the switch. Marco aimed but stopped. Antonio smiled at Elena. Your mother is safe, but Samuel built more than one secret into this warehouse. Red lights suddenly appeared along the support columns. Luca looked around, then at the countdown screen above them. 2 minutes. Elena dropped beside him, pressing her hand over his wounded shoulder while he tried to rise. Stay down. Luca shook his head. Not without you. Antonio reached the exit. Then Elena noticed something on her father's device, a flashing symbol she remembered from his notebooks. Her eyes widened. The detonator wasn't controlling the countdown. The silver device was. And with 1 minute 57 seconds remaining, Elena realized she was the only person in the warehouse who knew how to stop it. Elena Moretti stared at the flashing symbol on her father's silver device, while the warehouse countdown dropped below 90 seconds. Luca DeSantis was on one knee beside her, blood darkening the shoulder of his charcoal suit, but his eyes were fixed on Elena instead of the wound. I know this symbol, she said. My father used it for emergency override. Antonio had already reached the riverside exit, still gripping the detonator he believed gave him control. Marco shouted for everyone to clear the building, but Elena didn't move. She opened the device's side panel with trembling fingers and found 3 tiny switches beneath the casing. 58 seconds. Elena. Luca's voice was rough through the prototype, but she heard the warning in it. She looked at him. My father built this system. He left it with me for a reason. Luca reached for her hand, then stopped himself. Even now, injured and surrounded by danger, he let her choose. Elena took his hand herself. Stay with me. Luca nodded. Marco moved Elena's mother behind a reinforced concrete barrier, while Victor, finally realizing Antonio had intended to sacrifice everyone in the warehouse, shouted, The red switch shuts the relay down. Elena looked at him sharply. How do you know? Because Samuel made me test the first prototype. Antonio spun around. Don't listen to him! That was enough. Elena understood the truth. Antonio was terrified she would succeed. 32 seconds. She pressed the red switch. Nothing happened. Antonio smiled. Wrong choice. Elena's heart dropped, but then she remembered something her father used to say whenever she helped him repair equipment at the kitchen table. Never trust the obvious switch. Engineers label what they want strangers to touch. She turned the device over and noticed a nearly invisible copper contact beneath the battery plate. "Dad," she whispered. She pressed her thumb against it. The countdown froze at 19 seconds. Every red light along the support columns shut off. Antonio's expression collapsed. Marco's men surrounded him before he could run. The detonator fell from his hand and struck the concrete uselessly. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Elena exhaled for what felt like the first time all night. Luca swayed beside her. "Luca!" She caught him before he fell, lowering him carefully to the floor. His wound was painful but not life-threatening. The bullet had passed through the upper part of his shoulder. Elena pressed Luca's folded handkerchief against it while Marco called the private medical team already waiting outside. Luca looked at her through the chaos. "Your mother?" Elena glanced toward the barrier. Her mother was safe, shaken but unharmed. Safe. Luca closed his eyes briefly, not from pain. Relief. Elena's mother crossed the warehouse and wrapped her daughter in a trembling embrace before looking down at Luca. "You protected her." Luca shook his head and looked at Elena. "She protected all of us." By sunrise, Antonio's betrayal was no longer a secret. Samuel Moretti's archive had reached every senior DeSantis council member before anyone could erase it. The records proved Antonio had financed Victor, arranged the attack that killed Matteo, framed Samuel, and later covered up Samuel's death. Victor surrendered and agreed to testify about what he knew. Antonio lost the power he had spent 15 years building in a single night, not because Luca had been more ruthless, but because the woman Antonio had dismissed as a frightened waitress had refused to let the truth die with her father. 3 weeks later, Bellucci's looked completely different to Elena. She wasn't wearing an apron. She sat at the same private table where strangers had mocked her, dressed in a deep blue dress she had chosen because she loved how it looked on her, not because it made her appear smaller. Luca entered wearing a black suit, his shoulder almost healed, the silver device resting discreetly behind his ear. Doctors had warned him that the prototype could not restore normal hearing, and some days sound would remain distant or distorted. Luca had accepted that. He no longer measured his life by what he had lost. When Elena stood, Luca walked directly to her, ignoring every person watching. "You're late," she said. He caught enough of her voice to smile. 2 minutes. "Mafia bosses don't get special rules. This one does." Elena laughed, and Luca stopped speaking. He simply listened. Her laughter was imperfect through the device, soft, broken by static, nothing like the sound he remembered from before the explosion. Yet to him, it was the most beautiful thing he had heard in 3 years. Months passed. Elena helped establish a foundation in Samuel Moretti's name to support affordable hearing technology, while Luca funded it without ever putting his own name above hers. He never asked her to change her body, become quieter, dress differently, or fit into his world. Instead, he made room for her exactly as she was, and Elena stopped apologizing for occupying that room. One evening, beneath warm lights on the terrace of Luca's Brooklyn home, he placed his coat around her shoulders as the wind came off the river. "You keep doing that," she said. "Doing what?" "Giving me your coat." Luca stepped closer. "You keep being cold." Elena smiled. "Maybe I just like when you notice." Luca took her hand openly, gently, the feared mafia boss choosing tenderness without hiding it. 3 years of silence had taught him how much could disappear without warning. Elena had taught him something harder. Hearing someone and truly seeing them were never the same thing. She had been mocked for taking up too much space, while he had spent years making himself emotionally unreachable. Somehow, the curvy waitress everyone underestimated became the woman who restored his trust, cleared her father's name, saved her mother, exposed a traitor, and reminded a powerful man that love did not make him weaker. It gave him something worth protecting without controlling. And Luca, in return, gave Elena what wealth alone never could, the certainty that she never needed to shrink to deserve respect, safety, or love. "So tell me this. If the person everyone underestimated became the one person who could save you, would you have the courage to trust them before it was too late? If Elena and Luca's story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more cinematic Mafia Boss stories about danger, healing, loyalty, and the kind of love that sees the person everyone else overlooked.